Hello, my name is Julie, and today I'm bringing you my ultimate guide to the fantasy genre. I am a lifelong fantasy fan. It has always been my favorite genre even when I was little, and I would like to say I'm pretty well versed in it. So I thought I would make you a guide for what we mean when we say different descriptors around fantasy books like high fantasy or soft magic or grimdark, and give you a few recommendations for each of those different things. So if you're new to the genre, this might be a great place to start to see where you would like to start picking up titles. Or if you're somebody who is already well versed in the genre, you might get some new recommendations. I had a lot of feedback from my Instagram post that this was helpful to people who were big fantasy fans, so I hope you also learned something. A little disclaimer to say, although I am pretty well versed in fantasy, I am not the be-all end-all expert. Lines defining subgenres and genres are blurry at best, they're kind of up to opinion, and they're not intended to be rigidly defined anyway. And I'm also coming at this from a reading perspective rather than a writing perspective. First off, let's talk about high and low fantasy, which you may not have even ever heard of low fantasy before. High fantasy does not mean that it is better than other fantasy books. The word high is referring to how different the world that you are inhabiting in this fantasy book is different from the real world. To be very brief, high fantasy, 95% of the time, means that it is set on a planet that is not Earth. But there's a little bit more nuance to it, and there's some traits that lean something to be more high fantasy or more low fantasy, meaning more realistic. So high and low fantasy essentially function as a spectrum, with the more fantastical elements something has, the higher fantasy it is. A high fantasy book is more likely to have a setting that is not Earth, or is not really inspired by any real-life Earth thing, non-human races or fantastical creatures, godlike beings and higher powers in play, as well as magic being an established and accepted part of the world. On top of that, it's likely to be a larger focus of the plot of the story. A low fantasy is more likely to have the opposite of that. It's going to be more likely to be on Earth, or very inspired by Earth. You're mostly only going to be dealing with humans, and magic is going to be more of the exception to the rule. It's something special that has come about that we're discovering. And you could say a lot of high fantasy books have traits of low fantasy and otherwise. Those are just what's more common in either of them. But I have put together a spectrum of books from lowest to highest fantasy. I worked really hard on this, so you could probably move a couple of these around, but I'm going to start from the lowest and kind of walk you up the spectrum of what is going to be higher fantasy. Summer of Salt by Katrina Leno is about a family where every woman eventually develops some sort of specific magical power. It's set on Earth. There's basically nothing magical that happens except for those magical powers, and the story is more focused on the actual character development rather than anything to do with the magic. Because of that, this is considered magical realism and is going to be shelved in general fiction rather than fantasy, but it still has those fantasy elements, and we'll talk about magical realism or fabulism more later. Then we've got Babel by R.F. Kuang, which is set at Oxford in the 1800s. This is an alternate history that uses a type of magic where differences between translations of the same word can alter properties of things. It's set in the real world. Magic is the rule and not the exception, but it's treated more like a technology than actual magic, and a lot of the themes and things that we're focusing on are the real-life consequences. The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden is set in Russia during the medieval period when Christianity is first putting its claws in. Our main character is trying to save the spirits of Russian folklore. It's set on Earth, but the magic is less realistic than that of Babel because it's involving these godlike and spirit-like creatures. The Bridge Kingdom by Danielle L. Jensen is not set on Earth. It's also not really inspired by anything that's on Earth. It's about a princess who is set to marry and then later assassinate a rival king. However, there's no magic in this world, so Is this high fantasy or low fantasy? You tell me. I don't know. Then we've got A Game of Thrones by George R. R. Martin, and I am specifically talking about book one because the series does get more high fantasy from here, but if you only look at book one, there are very few instances of magic used. The setting is very much inspired by England during the War of the Roses. It's mostly an intense political fantasy rather than focusing on those magical elements. It is high fantasy, but it's not the highest. The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss is exactly what you think of when you think of fantasy. It's about a powerful sorcerer and swordsman who has retired and gone into hiding, but is now telling his life story. It's not set on Earth, it's vaguely inspired by medieval Europe. It's got a magic system, and our main character is training in it and also learning how to use a sword. There's a couple of magical races going on. So this is very classic what you think of fantasy. Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor is not set on Earth, and it's very much not inspired by it. It's very whimsical in its differences from Earth. A lost city whose name later disappeared from existence is being found again, only to find out that it was occupied by these godlike beings. There's a couple of different magics going on. We focus on non-human characters, and especially in the second book, things get very wild and away from reality. And The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson is just about as high fantasy as it gets. It's not set on Earth, and it focuses heavily on the cultural and also physical differences that this planet has from Earth. It's about a world with magical storms that keep ravaging a planet, and an ancient evil is rising up, so humanity has to learn how to do magic again to fight it back. There's multiple fantasy races and planes of existence, and a lot of the focus of the story is figuring out the magic. So as you can see, all of these books have some sort of fantasy element, but they range in how much they're utilizing fantasy versus real life. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about high fantasy or low fantasy. Now let's move on to hard and soft magic. This is a spectrum about how meticulous the magic system is built up in the story. A hard magic system has a lot of rules, and the characters are working hard to figure out what the different mechanics are. There's a lot of training montages of figuring stuff out, and there's going to be payoffs later because we know how the magic works. Versus low fantasy is going to be played fast and loose. There's going to be somebody who has a fireball, and they're going to throw it. We don't need to know how they cast the fireball, because they can cast fireball. Neither of these systems is better for the other, it's just what serves the purpose of the story more. Because I am a nerd, I have made a graph that combines high-low fantasy with hard-soft magic to kind of give you an idea of how these different things can interact in a fantasy book. So looking at high fantasy with a hard magic system, of course I have to talk about Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This has a magic system where some people can ingest different metals, and depending on what metal they ingest, they have different abilities that involve physics around them, like being able to push off of something or pull on something. The magic is tested with trial of error and uses real-life physics to show how it works. The Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks is an epic urban fantasy that is inspired by the light spectrum. Different people, when they can see a specific wavelength of light, can then use that light to then create a physical material that has specific properties to that type of light. There's a lot of fun engineering that goes on during this book as people are trying to figure out what all the different types of light do. Then we get into high fantasy soft magic. Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien is a fantastic example of this. Yes, it's a high fantasy book, we're definitely not in Kansas anymore, and Gandalf can cast Fireball. However, Frodo has no idea how Gandalf can cast Fireball, and he doesn't have the Silmarillion. It's not important to the story why Gandalf can cast magic. He just can, and that's fine. Another high fantasy book that has a soft magic system, I'm gonna go with the Daevabad trilogy. This is inspired by Jinn and Middle Eastern Muslim folklore around those types of magics. And our main character happens to have some sort of healing magic, and she does have to work harder to make her healing work more, but we don't really have some sort of mechanic about it. There's not much more rhyme or reason than people have the abilities that they do. Then we have low fantasy soft magic. So these are books that are mostly going to be set on Earth, and the magic is going to be played fast and loose. That's going to be most of your low fantasy. The Night Circus by Aaron Morgenstern is a perfect example of this. This is about a magic circus where there are magicians who are competing to have the best magical exhibits. While the magical exhibits are most of the book, we don't find out how these people can do what they do. They just pull off random magic because they can and it sounds cool. An entirely different vibe, but still fitting in that category, is She Who Became the Sun by Shelley Parker Chan. This is a fantasy book about the establishment of the Ming Dynasty. There's very little magic that we do see. There's some people that seem to have like mandate of heaven sort of thing, and there are also these ghosts that appear to people without a whole lot of explanation. It just kind of heightens the emotions of this political fantasy. Then we have the hardest category to come up with, and that is low fantasy hard magic. You don't see it very often. I am going to bring up Babel by R.F. Kuang again because it is such a fantastic example. This, again, is translation-based magic. We get a lot of detail as our character is personally training in how to make this type of magic work. Then we have Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. This is a weird pick, but this is an urban fantasy where our main character is raised by chimera, creatures that are different parts of animals put together, and there is a magic system where you create necklaces of different types of animal teeth, string them together and do like a ritual over them, and that will create a new chimera body. And there's a lot of rules with how like souls are moved around in this so that you as the reader know the limitations of the magic very well. Even if it's not like the most realistic type of magic, I would consider this to be hard magic, especially for a low fantasy vibe. Those are the spectrums I'm going to talk about. Now we can go into talking about a bunch of different subgenres in fantasy and some books that I think you should pick up in each of them. Let's start with epic fantasy. You've probably heard the word epic fantasy thrown around a lot. You might hear it completely conflated with the term high fantasy, because the term epic fantasy is almost entirely up to opinion. Epic fantasy describes the scale of the story. It describes stories that are larger than life. The term epic comes from epic poetry and was first used to describe the books Lord of the Rings, and then later in the 90s, Wheel of Time. These books pick from a buffet of world-building elements to create a large story. There's a big cast of characters. There's a huge world with different landscapes and cultures to explore. The fate of the world is at stake. Not only that, it's probably going to have a massive page count, although that's not necessarily the limit of it. The entirety of Lord of the Rings is only 1,000 pages. I've read book series that are longer than that are not considered epic fantasy. What people draw the line on what epic fantasy is entirely different from person to person. Some people only consider like a top, like maybe 5 series to be epic fantasy. Some people consider every single high fantasy to be epic fantasy. I think it's a healthy in-between. I think there's a little bit of elitism into what type of authors are allowed to be considered epic, but here are some recommendations that I have for you. Obviously, I'm going to start with The Way of Kings. The Stormlight Archive is my favorite series of all time, and as I mentioned before, it's about magic storms ravaging a planet. We follow a bunch of different characters who are all in different walks of life that are all pushed into this singular conflict. I just think that this has some of the best characters, best world building, best magic stuff going on. It's really, you cannot beat it. And each of these books is over 1,000 pages. So it's definitely epic in terms of page count. I'm also going to recommend The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, which is a standalone fantasy. It does have a prequel, but this is a singular standalone fantasy book that I believe is epic fantasy. It's like 900 pages or something, which is basically the length of a normal trilogy. But we are in a world that has this prophecy that a giant worm is going to come and destroy all of the world, and there is one kingdom that believes its line of queens is the only thing holding them back, and we follow a bunch of different people from different continents across this world, all trying to stop this one catastrophe from happening. And lastly, I'm going to talk about The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I've already mentioned R.F. Kuang. That was one of my favorites. This is inspired by the rape of Nanjing, a real-life historical thing that happened, and our main character, Rin, is a young woman who is determined to get out of her situation. She enrolls in a magical military school where she is going to learn to be a soldier, but when the war actually comes, it is much more devastating than she ever thought it would be. So this is definitely grand in terms of scale. There's nations and cultures at stake. This is definitely one of the more recent titles that I think is going to get that epic fantasy title in the upcoming years. Then let's talk about urban fantasy. An urban fantasy is a fantasy that has at least 1800s level technology. Basically, industrial revolution and past. It could be Victorian era, it can be today, it can be futuristic. Any of that falls into urban fantasy. And I've got a little spectrum for you here. Let's start at the bottom. The lowest urban fantasy you can get The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This is about a girl who lived centuries ago, who made a deal with the devil so that she wouldn't have to get married, but it turns out that she didn't exactly get what she wished for, and now nobody can possibly remember her after they turn away from her. And she is now in modern day New York, and she finds a boy who can finally remember her. This has basically one magical element to it, but most of it is about like the interpersonal relationships, and there's not like a wider magic system than that. Then you've got something like The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. This is about a group of teenagers who are all obsessed with a dead Welsh king, and they believe by awakening ley lines they can awake the king and get a wish. There's a lot of fun witchy vibes going on here, and the magic is just a unique flavor. It's not what you think of when you think of high fantasy, but these people do have modern technology. They can call each other. We've got Legendborn by Tracy Dion. This is inspired by Arthurian legend, but it is set at UNC Chapel Hill. Our main character ends up getting wrapped into the magic of the continuation of the Arthurian line and finds out she also has some magic from her ancestors that has not been widely accepted. Then we have City of Bones and just the general Shadowhunter world by Cassandra Clare. This is set in the real world, but do we interact with the real world very much past the first couple books? Not really. We're really focused on the world within the world. And this is what most people think of when they think of urban fantasy. Then we've got Jade City by Fonda Lee. This is set on a place that is not Earth, but it is extremely inspired by 1970s Japan. That's the kind of technology we're looking at. This is about one of the gang families that runs this city, and the entire trilogy is about this giant gang war that is happening to try to control this city. Then we have Foundry Side by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is a high fantasy where the magic is basically magic coding. You write something down in this certain script and you can change the properties of the material. It's inspired by real life coding, and the setting is inspired by Venice. We've got the Lightbringer series that I mentioned before. This has people using the magic to create technologies. Like in the first book, our main character creates a speedboat. So because of that, there's a weird balance of what type of technology is involved, because it's just whatever the characters decide to create. Then there's the second Mistborn series, which takes place hundreds of years after the Mistborn trilogy. It's like 1800s level, it's flintlock, we've got people who have guns. It is supposed to be feeling like the Old West, which is about at that level of being urban fantasy. All of that, but it is still set in that same fantasy world, but now the magic is a little bit more prevalent. Then there's a subset of urban fantasy I want to talk about, and that is portal fantasy. This is where a person stumbles across a portal to a magical world. So our world does exist in this sort of multiversal type setup, but There is also a magical world that most of the book is probably going to take place in. The Darker Shade of Magic trilogy by V.E. Schwab is like this. One of our main characters lives in 1800s London, and then she finds that she can go between different parallel worlds. They all have a city called London stacked in the same place across these different planes. I also mentioned City of Brass before, but the Daevabad trilogy has a main character who lived in 1800s Cairo, finding a portal to this magical djinn city. There's also the Wayward Children series by Shauna Maguire, which is about the trope of a portal fantasy where children go off to a magical world and now they've come back, and a lot of those children haven't adjusted properly, so they go to a special home to rehabilitate themselves. Next up, we've got a pretty popular one, and that is historical fantasy. So most fantasy is going to be inspired by some place or time, but historical fantasy is putting an emphasis on that influence. It's specifically supposed to be set in or evoking a specific place and time. And this, of course, can be low fantasy or high fantasy. One that I'll talk about as a low fantasy title is The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Catherine Arden. This is the same author of The Bear and the Nightingale, but this is about a brother and sister during World War I. The sister is a nurse who was sent back home, and the brother has gone MIA, and the sister is trying to find her way back to her brother. There is a magical force that is sort of trying to keep the brother in place. Historical fantasy also tends to take a lot of notes from the mythology and folklore of the place and time, integrating them into that place and time to make a larger story. A Thousand Ships is a retelling of some stories of the Odyssey and the Iliad, but seen solely through the eyes of the women of these stories. As a person who is a huge fan of Greek mythology, I really recommend this one because it does a fantastic job bouncing between the different timelines to give an entirely new shape to the story. This is a retelling fantasy. I don't know that I would consider it its own subgenre, but because this is set in ancient Greece, I would sort of consider that part of the historical fantasy thing. Last one that I'll talk about is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is set in a world inspired by pre-Columbian America, where we have all of these different groups that are getting ready for a solar eclipse that is going to occur also on the winter solstice. And there are all these different political and cultural groups that are gearing up for something terrible to happen on that day. It is inspired by indigenous cultures and pre-colonial America, but we have the mythology of those people being active on the page. Next up, let's talk about magical realism or fabulism. I recently found out that magical realism is the term that is used to refer specifically to the Hispanic storytelling tradition of integrating magic into a real-life story, telling a larger-than-life tale still based in reality. Fabulism is the term for the same thing, but not about specifically the Hispanic tradition. So magical realism is the term that is most used, but its definition comes from something more specific. But this is about a realistic story that has a little bit of magic in it. Maybe somebody has a magic power, or somebody finds a magic artifact, but this magic is not going to be explained. It's not the point of the book, it just adds an extra element of storytelling to it. Like I said before, these books are going to be shelved in general fiction because they don't have enough fantasy to it to warrant being put in a new shelf. One that I'll recommend is The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan. This is a YA magical realism about a girl who has lost her mother to suicide, and our main character decides to go meet her mother's family in Taiwan for the first time, but our main character also believes that her mother has turned into a bird. There's also a magical element of reliving memories. A little bit more on the literary fiction side, we've also got Beloved by Toni Morrison. This is like the Southern Gothic book. This is inspired by a real-life story of an enslaved woman who's running away from her captors and ended up killing her baby so that her baby would not be enslaved. And this is about Setha, who has successfully escaped slavery, but did the same thing. She did sacrifice her child so that it did not go back into slavery, and she believes she is being haunted by the ghost of this child, who she named Beloved. Then we've also got The Inheritance of Orchidea Divina. If you're an adult who is a fan of Encanto, I'm going to say this is a recommendation for you. This is about Orchidea Divina, who is the matriarch of a family, and each of the people in this family have gotten some sort of magical power. And when Orchidea is dying, the whole family is coming to send her off. Stuff about her past starts coming back to haunt the family. Let's talk about a pretty popular subgenre lately, and that is cozy fantasy. Cozy fantasy is the antithesis of epic fantasy. Yes, it's going to have those fantasy elements, but the idea here is we want low stakes. We want a comfortable environment with those fantasy elements. A lot of what you see in low fantasy is something like The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. This is about a modern day witch who has felt very isolated in her life because she's not allowed to talk about her magical powers. But when a home that has been caring for 3 young girls who have magical powers find out about her, they reach out and ask her to help them raise these children and use their powers. And there's also a grumpy librarian that she is going to fall in love with. I think it's pretty common for cozy fantasy to have elements of historical fantasy or also a strong romance plotline. They may be considered more of a romance book than a fantasy book. Another good one is, I've gotta mention it, Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is inspired by The Princess Bride, and our main character, Tress, has had her best friend captured and taken away from her, and she decides that she is going to go save him. But to do that, she has to go on these pirate ships that are on these seas that are made out of spores. So it's a real life integration of the physics property of fluidization. Very cool science behind this fantasy world that is also a pretty cozy, feel-good story. And one that I just read and love, The Spell Shop by Sarah Beth Durst, is about a librarian of spell books whose city was just sacked, so she saved hundreds of spell books and has run away to her former home. The only thing is that it's actually illegal for anybody who's not sanctioned to use magic, so her having these books is illegal. So she's gonna hide them, except the island that she's on is actually dying because magic is not being used to save it. So she is going to have to choose whether she wants to save the island and possibly be arrested or killed for it, or if she wants to let it go. Tying into that, the most popular fantasy genre at the moment is fantasy romance. This is a book that has fantasy and romance. But what makes the difference between a fantasy romance, or a romantasy as it's sometimes known, and a book with a romance subplot? It's just the amount of focus that the romance plot gets. If the romance is just as important as the fantasy to the book, I would consider that to be a fantasy romance. My number one recommendation for this would be The Bridge Kingdom by Daniela Jensen, which I did talk about before. This is a series that is made up of 3 duologies, each following a different couple. And in the first one, our main character is a princess who has been trained to be an assassin, fakes the death of her sisters to sacrifice her life for this cause and let them live their lives, and she ends up marrying the rival king with the intention to kill him, but it turns out he might not be so bad after all. I think this is the perfect integration of a political fantasy plot, and also sometimes like survival fantasy plots, with a romance. I'll bring up Strange the Dreamer again by Laini Taylor. This is a YA fantasy romance where our main character has been studying this lost city, and when the expedition for the city happens, he goes along and he ends up meeting this girl in his dreams that he immediately falls in love with. And it turns out the girl in his dream actually exists, and she is locked in this essentially prison that is looming over the city. She is one of the children of the gods that had enslaved the city below. And another popular one right now is Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross. This is in a high fantasy setting, but it is inspired by the World Wars era, and our main characters have magic typewriters that can write to each other. One of them knows who the other one is, but the other one does not know who they are writing to, and they are rival reporters who are then sent to go to the war front, and they end up falling in love in wartime. Let's talk about dark fantasy. Dark fantasy, I don't think this is like a super popular subgenre, or at least it's not very well categorized. Dark fantasy has some sort of, as one would imagine, dark element. It's got an element of horror, or maybe dark fairy tale, or gothic. It's got that darker vibe to it. I think the best example of dark fantasy is the Witcher series, where our main character is a witcher who is a person who has been raised and genetically changed to be able to fight evil monsters. And there is a lot of dark fairy tale vibe to this series. I've read only the first book, but it plays out much like a fairy tale of, like, you know, here's an ironic twist. Here's this element of fate going on. There's The Helm of Midnight by Marina Lostetter. This is about when someone dies, you can imbue a mask with their spirit. If somebody wears that mask, it will let them interact with that person's greatest talent. And one man's greatest talent was killing. This mask has been stolen, and we follow 3 perspectives. One person who is trying to track down the mask, one person who had an interaction with the stolen mask in the past, and the actual serial killer. And these plots are really well tied together. There are different types of gods. Time is a currency here. There's a lot of weird high fantasy stuff going on. Really interesting blend of fantasy and horror. Another one that I'll talk about is The Diviners by Libba Bray. This is a series that is set in 1920s New York, where there are paranormal cult-like killings happening, and our main character has the ability to read objects, so when her uncle is recruited to help with the case, she decides to tag along to try to help him. And this has a fantastic, almost like Stephen King-like horror villain of this ghost-type creature who is stalking down his prey and killing people one by one. Not to be confused with dark fantasy is Grimdark Fantasy. This is not about a horror element. The horror here is real life. Grimdark Fantasy brings in an element of grittiness and realism that means that our main characters are morally gray or even amoral. They often make disastrously wrong decisions that lead to terrible, grave consequences. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of blood, people are gonna be killed and never come back. It just has an entirely different tone to a lot of fantasy where the tone is hopeful and people might be brought back. I haven't read a lot of books that I would truly call grimdark, so I'm only going to talk about a few. Of course, the main one to talk about is Game of Thrones. This is so well researched, it's absolutely realistic, where so many people are perpetrating violence against so many other people. So much terrible stuff is happening to every single person on page. Another good one, I would consider The Lies of Locke Lamora to be a grimdark fantasy. I do think this is interesting because it does have a comedic tone that is blended with the grimdark, but the stuff that happens to the characters is absolutely devastating. This is about our main character, Locke Lamora, who is so good at thieving, he was kicked out of a thieving orphanage and is being raised to be the ultimate con man. And when a coup of the city's gang leaders is about to occur, all that Locke holds dear is on the line. And I'll bring it up one more time, The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang is totally grimdark. Anybody could die at any time. So many people are going to be killed by every single decision that somebody has because this is a war-heavy fantasy. Is anybody actually good here? that sort of thing, you are going to see terrible, terrible, terrible stuff happen on page. But yeah, that's all I prepared for today, and trust me, I prepared a lot for this. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you got a recommendation out of this. Hopefully there is one book on here that you have not read that you can now pick up. I tried to keep to only books that I had rated 4 stars or above, to try to give you my best recommendations that also fit within the parameters of what I was talking about. I'd love to know what your favorite elements of fantasy are. Let me know if there's any sort of subgenres that you'd like me to maybe explain in the future. Maybe I should go through some fantasy archetypes and tropes. Maybe that would be interesting. And let me know what your favorite books are in all of these subgenres, because I'd love to get more recommendations. If you would like to see me read more fantasy books in the future, please hit that subscribe button. I'd love to have you with me on my reading journey of getting more fantasy books on this list. If you would like to find me anywhere else on the internet, you can find me at that singular link in the description that has everything that I do. And as always, I will see you in the next one.